So thank you so much for your participation on this topic. David, I have to tell everyone that this idea came from you, which we found to be very interesting. A topic that I had to admit that we never covered before. We always focused on the procedural side, on the technology side, on the business side, but amazingly so, we never discussed how to ensure adequate funding to parliamentary operations and to its modernization. So I think here, and I recognize here this idea from David in this regard and suggesting this panel. So just to explain a little bit to you, I will pose a few questions to each one of you, and then I will ask everyone else to comment on that. And then to close the round, I will ask the first responder to make any final comments you have very briefly. So allow me to bring my first question to you, David, if you allow me. As parliaments they evolve to address the changing needs of MPs, staff, and the citizens, the modernization of these institutions, they become paramount. And however, the journey towards modernization is not without obstacles of political, cultural, procedural, technical, and financial dimensions. And our focus here today is the latter, is the financial focus as we discussed. Thus, we will deep dive on how to ensure the resources for Parliament to modernize. David, given this backdrop, what are the primary fiscal challenges we face in ensuring adequate funding for such a significant undertaking? And before you answer the question, if you can also introduce yourself to the colleagues and tell your relation to this specific topic. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the question. So I'm David Wilson. I'm the Clerk of the House of Representatives in New Zealand. So part of that role is Chief Executive of the Office of the Clerk. And I think when I was asked to be in this panel, we'd just finished our budget round. And so it was at top of my mind, reduction in funding again. That made me think, well, actually, you know, one of the main obstacles to modernisation is funding of the legislative branch. And I think the sort of primary fiscal challenges are probably at the moment the global recession, and certainly in New Zealand's case, a growing national debt and an upcoming election, which is in a month's time, and certainly concern from political parties that they don't want to be seen to be splashing around taxpayers' money. But I'm not sure that fiscal challenges are the greatest ones in the case of parliaments. I think certainly in the New Zealand case, there's a reluctance for MPs to be seen to be spending money on themselves. As an example, their salaries have been frozen for about 6 years. They passed special legislation to prevent the independent body that sets their salaries from increasing them because they're worried about the public perception. I think they're also concerned, therefore, that if they fund parliamentary agencies to any greater level, it may look as if they're, you know, channeling the money towards themselves. And while I think we've got, you know, good civic institutions and protections to ensure that it isn't what's happening, they'll be concerned about the public perception. So I think that's important. I think there's also amongst legislators a disconnect with the budget process. When the budget round that I mentioned at the start, when that began, and I went to a select committee and talked to them about how you know, our funding was insufficient and certain services were going to have to stop because we couldn't afford them anymore. The comment from the committee was, well, we don't set your budget, but we're sorry to hear that. And I had to sort of make the extraordinary comment, you actually do set my budget. Parliament is the one that appropriates the money. It's not the government. But so there's some disconnection there that I think there's a feeling amongst some MPs that Parliament just happens and they're not entirely sure how, which is in some ways quite a sort of a flattering view of how it all works. It reflects well on the staff that provide those services, but it does mean it's quite difficult to make any progress in this area. And we're not, in our case, asking for lavish sums of money, but certainly would like to be able to keep providing the services that we are and to modernise some of these things as well. I think one of the other challenges is that Cabinet controls finance in the New Zealand Parliament and commonly in Westminster-derived parliaments. Although the Parliament ultimately appropriates the money, it is through the governing parties that have majority in the House. Parliament doesn't deliver on the government's promises or policies either. So it's probably not a very attractive destination for additional funding, if you like. And in fact, it may do the opposite. It often scrutinises and criticises the government. And while it can strengthen government performance and really test that actual spending decisions and policy decisions are justified, it can also probably be unattractive to ministers to increase the capacity to do that. And I think perhaps the final factor in play, in my experience, is that the amounts involved are, in the government's overall scheme of things, trivial. At the moment, in New Zealand, just spending on core departments, the legislative departments receive less than 1% of that funding. So that's not including sort of frontline services like funding healthcare, but just the actual agencies, the executive, get 99.3% of the funding. The Parliament gets 0.7%. I don't know what the right figure should be, but it does seem exceptionally low, given that that branch is supposed to scrutinise the other one. So I think the fact that it's so small, some of the initiatives can seem minor or unimportant to the Treasury or to ministers who are dealing often in billions of dollars, when we might just be talking about bidding for $1 million or $2 million New Zealand. So there's a lot of factors in play. I think that reluctance for members to be seen to be spending money on themselves, misunderstanding perhaps on the part of some members about how the appropriations process works, and the fact that actually funding Parliament more extensively isn't that attractive to the government of the day.
Thank you so much, David, for your opening thoughts. Before I yield the floor to Natalie, it's just one consideration. I'll put in my hat as a political scientist here in Brazil. We have a huge problem in Brazil as well on members being perceived as spending money on themselves. Even though they are not spending on themselves, they are hiring people for the staff, they are procuring services they need to exercise their mandate. And there is a misconception sometimes in the media and civil society that members should not be spending money on that. And even there are some rankings for political leaders putting as one of the metrics for these rankings as the economy on the mandates. But it makes no sense. You are spending to procure a much lower service, a much lower quality service. And what is the cost of not exercising your mandate properly? So just one very short consideration on what you just said. Here in Brazil, this is an ongoing issue as well. And since we don't have metrics to analyze the successfulness of parliamentary mandates, such metrics are being used, such as how much each mandate is spending on personnel, on services, etc. And even other metrics that are on the topic today, such as number of proposals being submitted, time in plenary, etc. But I completely agree, this is an issue here in Brazil as well. Natalie, would you like to introduce yourself to us and comment on this question and what has been said as well?
Sure, great. Thank you. And thank you again for having me today on the panel. So my name is Natalie Foster. I am in the clerking world, just like David. So a clerk assistant and table officer at the House of Commons in Canada. So happy to bring that perspective. I'm responsible for a team as well who deals with a lot of the technological projects, but from the business perspective, so from the procedural side, partnering, of course, with all of our technical experts. So it's a fairly unique position, and that relationship with our technical team will probably weave through some of the answers and the way we've tried to find success despite the fiscal restraint that we are dealing with. Maybe first I'll pick up on a couple of threads from what David had mentioned, and then I'll add a few things from our parliament. So we are in a minority government situation. We're also in a situation where, of course, inflation, high debt load coming out of the pandemic, and so a lot of public pressure to rein a lot of that in. And some of the discourse recently has shifted to getting some more control of that public debt, of potentially reducing spending by government departments. The House of Commons is not necessarily mentioned specifically, as David alluded to. There's not necessarily a lot of understanding among the public about the difference between the legislative branch and the executive branch, which can cause confusion when you're asking for funds or when you're trying to do something to support democracy versus to support a government initiative. There is a bit of a public perception issue for us in terms of that debt spending, but I would say there's not a lot of public scrutiny per se on the House of Commons budget. There is more on what members spend, and that reaches back to the point of the perception of members spending on themselves. But when it comes to the House of Commons budget, we do have a set budget, of course, agreed to by Parliament itself. A large portion of that budget is directly to members, to their staffing, to their office, and to their salaries. And then there's a leftover portion of that budget that is for the administration. And so we have a certain amount that we're able to spend on our personnel, our resources, and our projects. And a lot of that is determined internally based on priorities that we set. But it is done in concert with what we call our Board of Internal Economy. And this is a board of members from all parties. And they're able to decide on how much we should spend on these major initiatives, if we need to ask for more money, what this budget is. So they're sort of that really important group that we would deal with as an administration in terms of going to get extra funds or just getting the funds that we need approved. So that can also add an interesting dimension for us, because of course, when we're trying to promote an idea and it doesn't necessarily touch their work directly, or that link isn't obvious, it can create challenges in that environment too, because that all feeds into that budgetary process. I would say for us, when we consider that environment, the funding that we have, the resources that we have, so there's money, but there's also people, there's always more ambition, more priorities than what we're actually able to accomplish. So I think one of our big challenges is within that envelope that we have, how do we prioritize our transformation initiatives? I'd say something around 80% of our staff and resources are in place just to do what I would call the run initiatives, the initiatives that we just need to run the place to make it work based on current technology, current members' needs. So that doesn't leave a lot of space after the fact to transform or to think more broadly or to expand or enhance on our services. So the challenge is always how to pick and choose between sort of the procedural teams, the legislative teams, and the technical teams. We've done a lot of work to come together to prioritize so that we can try to figure out where we should put our money, where we should put our people. And I think that process operationally is fairly mature. But I think where we need to get a little bit further in terms of a corporate maturity or administrative maturity is to try to look at it broadly across the whole house. So we have this new vision of one house, one team accomplishing our different projects together. And so working on that governance to make sure that we can all agree as an administration where we want to put our limited efforts so that we're able to serve members and ultimately the members in serving the public as well. So I think I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
David, would you like to share your thoughts and close this round with your considerations?
Well, I agree with what the other panelists have said, and I think just picking up on Ari's point, that's right. There is a real sensitivity around things like that, and although our numbers are much smaller, the same sort of things happen when you multiply any cost by about 1,500 or 2,000 people. Suddenly, it looks outrageous. Members' travel expenses are a really common one. They're seen as a perk of the job. And I point out to everyone who says this to me that if I'm expected to travel for work, I wouldn't pay for it personally. I'd expect my employer to pay. But that disconnect is not there. There's quite a common thought in New Zealand that MPs should be paid the minimum wage or the median wage or something like that. And thinking about that a bit, there are obvious problems with either attracting people who want to do that job in return for that sort of remuneration, and the other sources of income people will look to if they're in that situation and they have access to decision-making power. So it is complicated, and I think the sensitivity to the public is probably one of the really strong features, and I really think it's just going to take members to be encouraged to just be a bit courageous about it and actually explain what they're doing and why. and put it in the context of the government's overall spending. And the same sort of thinking is around the coffee expenses. It doesn't start to look so bad.
Thank you so much, David, for your consideration. And very interesting example of the coffee. I had never had read something about this before. Natalie, allow me to bring my second question to you. Given that parliaments primarily provide indirect services to society and act as custodians of the democratic process, how can we define and measure the parameters of success of an investment in modernization from a parliamentary perspective? I mean, for example, when we are investing on public education, public health, public security, and many other areas in the executive branch, you have tangible services that can be analyzed and used by the population. But in case of parliament, as I mentioned, this is an indirect service, is to ensure political representation, is to ensure the lawmaking process, is to ensure the oversight of public policies. So how can we measure? Are there some metrics that we can use to measure the investment or modernization activities in parliaments?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I'll maybe describe a few of the measures that we like to look at in the Canadian House of Commons, and then maybe some areas that we could explore or push a little bit further. So I think for us, because the service to the public is fairly indirect, one of our primary measures of satisfaction is actually our direct client satisfaction. So the members, are we equipping them, giving them the tools that they need in order to go back and serve their constituents and to exercise their function as legislators? I think a really great example of this is a recent project that we had. Of course, through the pandemic, we all had to adapt and to figure out new ways of doing things. And one thing that we were charged with developing at the House of Commons was a voting application so that members could vote remotely. This is something that we've actually maintained after the pandemic sort of has ended or quietly ended. So through that development process, you can always measure client satisfaction at the end. However, sometimes then you're going to miss little things. So what we actually did through that whole development process, we took an agile approach and we involved the client in the actual development of the tool. We made sure that they were there to comment on iterations of it, to give us further direction. And I think that's an example of a recent project where we had very fruitful exchanges with our House leaders, with our whips, and directly with political staff. It was also great help in terms of change management too, because they were involved in the process. There was training, there were simulations. So in the end, the satisfaction is almost built into that because they were involved in the development of the solution itself. And so that's one way that we're looking more and more to make sure that members are either represented in some of that development, whether it's directly or whether it's indirectly by considering the different personas, if you will, who might use the product and why. Members are a clear one, but members of the media are another one, and journalists. We have the public as well. So when we're developing tools, we try to keep those personas in mind, and we try to contact or interact with those different groups if possible. I think the second thing that's quite important, and it's a little bit related, but it's about staff buy-in as well. So when we're thinking about our staff supporting members and our staff supporting our clients the best way possible, we have to make sure that they are also engaged in the change and that they also understand the purpose of the change and their role in it. And one way we've tried to approach that with our digital services partners is by involving the doers, I would say, the operations people directly in the project. So rather than have a group sort of set aside who are separate attack a problem, we have the people who actually live every day with that service, with that problem, with that service delivery model, try to make it improve upon it. And so part of that satisfaction or the measure of success is also the ability of staff to use and understand and support members with the new tool. And that's been successful for us. And then the third element I wanted to bring in was that of the public. I think part of that is around transparency. So while as administrators, we don't necessarily have that direct line to the public, obviously we do through the members and we get that feedback, but I think we do have a responsibility to provide transparency to the public. So in our case, the Canadian public. We do that through reporting every year on the projects of the House of Commons. It's all available online. We post that document annually. We table the report in Parliament. We participate in public committee meetings where we defend that work and answer questions about that work. And while the average citizen may not be fully paying attention to some of those processes, we are able to expose that to them. And if there was an area maybe where we could push some of that a little bit further, it would probably be that third one. So what is our responsibility in terms of promoting that work to the public so that it's better understood? And perhaps some of my co-panelists have some thoughts there about what's been going on for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. David would like to comment on that as well.
Yeah, thank you. And again, we have some quite similar thoughts about that as with Natalie. So we have set some success criteria in different areas, and I might just mention a few of those. So recently, we've had a review of our parliamentary rules and standing orders. And one of the main focuses of that was improving parliamentary scrutiny of the executive. And we recommended to the committee doing that they think about how they know if that was successful or not. And it is difficult because there's a whole lot of behavioural things going on there that are difficult to quantify or understand. But we thought as a start, because one of the major complaints was that committees didn't spend enough time scrutinising the government, was actually just to measure how much time they spend on it. We have a baseline, and we're going to come back at the end of the next Parliament in 3 years' time and see whether that's increased and find out some more metrics about the nature of the scrutiny. So it probably won't give us direct measures of quality, but it will be a start. It will tell us something about whether the changes that were made have actually resulted in a behavioural change. We have some measures for engagement with the public as well. And again, like Natalie, our focus isn't on engaging the public with us, it's engaging them with MPs, their elected representatives. But we do measure public participation through such things as submissions to select committees, which we've made a lot of effort to encourage and may have been a little bit too successful. They're getting numbers now that are quite hard for our staff to deal with. But also the number of people petitioning Parliament on the basis that we want it to be easy for people to do these things if they want to do it. We don't, we're not trying to encourage everyone to do it, but just that they know how to if they want to and they know they can. One that's at a slight distance from us, but we still think is worth considering is voter turnout at the election. We're not directly responsible for that. We don't run the elections. But we are responsible for quite a lot of connection between MPs and the public, the voting public, and so we kind of use that as a macro trend, I guess, to see whether we think things are heading in the right direction. And engagement is trending upwards. We don't know for sure if that's anything to do with what we're doing, but it's a good sign anyway and a good thing. So it's at about, I think, about 81% at the moment, 81%. And with the election in a month's time, hopefully it'll be a little bit higher. We look at things like public feedback and public engagement scores as well. So we do a bit of market research with the public to the extent that the budget allows to find out what they think about Parliament. And recently we've engaged with people who appeared before select committees as witnesses to find out what they thought of that experience. And they gave some really useful feedback on that, which are things we would have never guessed or known or understood ourselves. And as Natalie mentioned as well, I think feedback from elected representatives is also really important. They're customers of ours, but they're also funders, even if they don't always know that, and scrutineers of the performance of agencies that they fund. So their perspective is an important and legitimate one. And so we do survey them, particularly presiding officers who we give a lot of advice to, but others as well. And there's always informal feedback channels as well. If MPs aren't happy about something, they usually just come to my office and tell me. So we know that and we collect those things. We can look at some other things that, the number of bills that are passed under urgency without committee scrutiny, for example, is something we keep an eye on and report on. And I guess overall, with modernisation program, really just think about what is most important in the modernisation efforts. What are you trying to achieve? And think about how to measure it. Even if the measure is not a perfect one, it is a start. And if you measure something, you are going to focus on improving it, and it's going to be a priority. And I say that measurement's not always perfect, and I'll give you an example. One of the things that we have to measure here for our auditors is the quality of the procedural advice we give, so on parliamentary law and practice that we give to MPs. Now, the difficulty with that is the only people who actually know whether our advice is right or not is us. And so it is a slightly circular discussion we have with our auditors every year. How do you know that this was right? Well, we just know. And they, well, can't you check with anyone else? We really can't. So it's not perfect, but something has to be done. And again, the fact that it is measured, I think, bring some focus on and make sure it's done. So that I guess that's what I'd say, just set some criteria, even if they're not perfect or great, they can develop later, but it does help focus the mind.
And Natalie, do you have any final thoughts on this round?
Maybe just to say quickly that I had a good chuckle when David said that they had to try to measure the quality of the procedural advice. I think that's a challenge for anyone to do, and there are so few specialists on those topics around the world. But maybe just to sort of tie a link between both of those comments, part of the public reporting that we do report on pure numbers. So how many e-petitions, how many hours in committee, how many witnesses. And while that doesn't necessarily measure success, it gives a good sense of volume and where to maybe put resources and where to put money. We have a few public-facing processes at our Parliament as well. So we have an e-petitioning portal and process where we do get client feedback through those mechanisms of being able to make adjustments to those systems based on the true experiences of citizens. And that's been a great success. And the integration of members and their offices into that process has been a good success for us. And we're also looking more and more at witness onboarding. So I think you mentioned that, David, those who appear before committee, that's a very special experience for a lot of people. It's their opportunity to share their thoughts, their concerns, their advice to members in committee. And we are looking internally at how to make that process a little bit more seamless, a little bit more comfortable for witnesses. So how can we change our processes and our technology to ensure that they're getting the experience that they want? So I just thought that I would make that interesting parallel. And then maybe just back to Ari on the customer design experience and trying to involve the members. That is something we're trying to do more and more. It's the challenge is sometimes choosing the key moment and where and who might be the right people to connect with. It doesn't always lead to money. Often we've had an idea where we might need change, or we've been asked to make the change, whether that's quickly or over the long term by the members. Usually that's an easier one to go get buy-in for. And not guessing. I think that's important. Even when I go back to that example of the voting app, what we thought they needed from a procedural legislative perspective and what they actually wanted from the tool didn't always perfectly align. So the fact that we did that together built a tool that worked for both purposes. And I think that was a big part of its success. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for your considerations. Allow me to bring my next question to you, David. When drafting a strategic document for parliamentary modernization funding, what are the essential elements to include, and how can such a strategy effectively align with both short-term needs and long-term sustainability goals? If you can share your thoughts on this, on how you develop such a document to be approved by the members or by the speaker himself.
Mm. Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I think, strategic planning for us happens in a variety of different ways. There isn't a single strategic plan for everything that we do. Some things involve members primarily, procedural change, for example. We advise them, but obviously they make the decisions. Some things that are technical changes that we make might need some kind of procedural endorsement or support. An example, the same as Natalie mentioned about e-petitions. We needed some rule changes to support their existence. And so I would really echo that point that's been made a couple of times that Ari did about not guessing what members want, but asking them. I did make that mistake once years ago of guessing, and I was wrong. Thinking that members would be happy to move to a paperless committee system. Many of the newer ones were, many of the longer serving ones were not, and just refused. And we could have actually worked that out at the time by consulting them. We just, I guess, got lost sight of that and thought it was an exciting development, and of course one they'd want to be on board with. So there are other modernisation decisions we make that are actually invisible to members. Most of the systems and applications that support the plenary and committees, they know nothing of and aren't actually involved in. The thing that produces the order paper, the agenda for the House, or deals with questions, they use them if they need to, but they have no idea how they work and no decision making around them. They know what they want. And so it happens at a variety of different levels. But I think the thing that's really important that I've come to realise recently is to present the counterfactual, as in what will happen if this system isn't upgraded, or this new, if there's no modernisation in this area, or if something isn't funded. Because I think it's important that the Parliament, and because in our case the decision maker is really the government, that it understands what will happen if the funding's not there. And in recent proposals for modernisation, we've said, well, if this doesn't happen, these will be the consequences. Also, just in general, budget rounds, saying, well, this is the amount of money we think we need to provide our current services. If you can't give that, then these are the things that we'll have to stop. And we're quite open about that. And it didn't, in one sense, it didn't work. The government said, okay, well, we don't mind if you stop those things. Go ahead. Members who are not in the government do mind, but they don't think they can do anything about it. So we do have a list, which, it's not something we'd ever developed before, of really in descending order of priority, things that will stop or be scaled back if our funding continues to slide backwards. And I think the thing is to be really open about that. So as Ari said, there are no lobbyists for Parliament, really. So to a degree that falls to me in New Zealand. And I can do that. I think as an independent statutory officer, I can say, well, this is what I think the Parliament needs. And it's not tremendously successful, but I don't think anyone thinks I'm doing it out of self-interest. I think that's generally accepted as out of concern for the Parliament. It just doesn't resonate with the government of the day. But I think it's important to be able to do that. And one of the obstacles really is that Treasury, which deals with the mechanics of the budget, doesn't understand Parliament and doesn't prioritise it, again, because it doesn't deliver on the government's goals. And the public service generally will often see Parliament as an impediment to avoid, if possible, or a rubber stamp that is just a process that it has to be gone through and is a foregone conclusion. And so I think there are some real difficulties and challenges, and part of my job is to set out for members who are the decision makers what those consequences will be. There are a few other people who join in. There's some academics. I think political scientists are really helpful in this regard, legal academics as well. And there's a former Prime Minister who is both a constitutional scholar and a legal academic, who is very outspoken on these things, and was a great reformer in New Zealand. So I guess he is one of the people who does actually lobby for Parliament. It just doesn't get that much cut through with the government. And so I think it's really important for it to understand, if there's no modernisation, if funding's not available, and we can't pay for everything, some things will have to stop, and these are what they are, and just be really open about that. And there's no shame in that. If you don't have money for something, you obviously can't pay for it. And I think it's just important to say so.
Thank you so much, David, for your thoughts on these. Natalie, would you like to comment on that?
Sure, thank you. I think, like David, we have a lot of similar experiences in Canada, in particular in relation to what I think I alluded to earlier is the run, and David sort of alluded to that too, the idea that committees, the order paper, the systems, the everyday operating systems also need to have improvements and maintenance done to them. And that's not obvious at all to the members or to the public, but it's still funding that's required. And then there's those transformational initiatives where you actually want to go beyond the run and the everyday to make a change. So for us, we have two processes in terms of making a case or a submission. So we have an internal one, which is more of what we'd call our technical roadmap. And we do that in partnership with our technical team and with our finance team. And that's where we look at things sort of like that run. What do we need to fix? What do we need to maintain? What can we enhance on a small scale, but that we're not necessarily going to expose to the members because it's not something that's going to speak to them directly. And we do that internal road mapping. We look ahead on a 2 or 3 year plan. At the same time, our technical team is always looking 5 to 10 years ahead. So they're trying to do a digital outlook about what is coming, what might we need to have on our radar. Obviously, in the technical world, you can try to do that and probably it's going to change, but it's just this idea of getting that environmental scan and thinking about what could come so that we're starting to plan a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of what we need to be ready for. I really like the question that David posed about what's the cost of not doing it. And I think when you expose it to your own staff, your own prioritization, or to the members, that's an important question. I think increasingly one of the answers to that is not only efficiency and even budget savings. If you have a system that works well and is more efficient, you don't necessarily need more people or more machines to do that work. But increasingly, we're seeing questions of security, of cybersecurity also play into some of that. And so you need tools that are secure to serve Parliament. You need tools that are ready and able to respond to the changing technological environment. And so sometimes the cost of not doing something is actually quite important. The other process I'll mention just very quickly, when we want to make a submission for a broader change and we want to bring it to that board, so the Board of Internal Economy, that's the type of thing where we would prepare a submission, we'd brief the speaker on that, we'd make sure that the senior leaders in the administration are aware, and that's a set template that has a series of measures in it that we have to make sure that we filled out. So there's always an analysis portion, there are key performance indicators, what's going on, what's the driver behind the change, and then we have a list of things that we need to go through. So obviously that includes what are the financial resources needed, what are the human resources needed, what are the legal requirements. So sometimes we're not doing something because we want to, but we're doing it because a law was passed that actually requires us to make a change within our Parliament. And so that's important. We always include communications as well. What's the impact there for the public, for the internal audience? And recently we've added a new element to that, which is on accessibility. So that's become an increasingly important conversation in Canada. How do we make our tools accessible, not only for the public, but for the members and for the employees as well? So one example of a recent submission was actually a law was passed in Canada requiring all government organizations to make a plan on accessibility and then to actually execute that plan. So the House of Commons has established that plan, but of course, we weren't able to do that with the existing resources. So that's the sort of thing that we put before the board to expose to them what we needed in order to make that plan happen that they had all agreed to and adopted in legislation. So it's another way to sort of make the link between the legislative function and the needs of the legislature. Thank you.
David, would you like to close this round with your thoughts again?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of congruence here, I think, between, what we're all saying. And it's a really good point that often the even requests for funding are too late. There's a constant program of renewal and upgrading and just keeping things current and working. And, eventually something will no longer be compliant and will need replacement. I think, in our case, we've got a lot better at keeping ahead of that. But, we are limited by, the systems we can depreciate and how much we can invest in keeping them up to date. So we've really, certainly in our case, reached a point where if the Parliament wants us to do anything new, it has to come with funding. Otherwise, we'll just have to say, I'm sorry, we can't do it. And I think members understand that. But it's really unfortunate, for the sake of a fairly small investment, there's a lot that could be done that's quite exciting. And like Natalie said in an earlier comment, the number of ideas always outstrip either the financial or human resources to implement them. That's not a bad thing. It's great for parliamentary staff to be creative and have a lot of ideas, but they always need prioritising. And certainly within some limits, it is really important to work with the private sector. And those limits are, I've refused to have sponsorship or advertising on some products that are provided because it would compromise our neutrality. But the private sector fills gaps really well. There is an increasing, there's a huge amount of innovation and seeking of customers, and an increasing amount of work done to, I think, to target parliaments as customers and tailor solutions to their needs, which is great. I mean, it's a much bigger innovative community than, you know, the small one I have within my own organisation. And so it's really valuable, and certainly for us, that business sector can fill gaps that we couldn't, you know, just things we wouldn't be able to provide otherwise. Live streaming of select committees for us at the moment is done on Facebook Live, because for us it's free. Now, it's not our ideal solution. We don't actually have much control over all of that data and the images and sound afterwards. If something goes wrong with it, you know, it's not really in our hands. So it's not ideal, and it's not our ultimate solution, but it works for now. And the alternative would be no live streaming. Social media channels to communicate directly to the public are incredibly important. And again, they're free because our information is the commodity. But it's not just that. It's you know, a lot of the ways that we communicate, the way that we caption parliamentary proceedings for the deaf community. Most of the business applications for the House and select committees wouldn't happen without private sector involvement. So it is hugely important. And many years ago, we did used to, you know, do in-house development of apps. A lot of bespoke applications became really hard to manage and update, and often they were developed by a single person. If they ever left, it was incredibly difficult to deal with those systems again, because they all had their own idiosyncrasies. So as much as possible, we do like to look to existing products, but as Ari said, to customise them to our needs. And I think it's a really, the other really important point he just made is around these changes being led by the business, by the people with the knowledge of what the Parliament needs, informed by the people who understand how this new system or application could work. So the two work together to figure out something that is going to work for the Parliament, and is going to be sustainable into the long term. So yeah, I certainly think there's a really important place, and we couldn't do a lot without it.
Thank you so much, David. Natalie, would you like to share your thoughts on this matter as well?
Yes, thank you. Maybe just a little bit of history, the Parliament of Canada, House of Commons, and picking up on threads from both David and Ari. Traditionally, we have done a lot of insourcing, so building apps internally. I think for a long time, there wasn't a lot available in the tech field and in terms of outsourcing or in terms of that business expertise. And we've always had this approach with our members of the white glove service, the red carpet service, and sometimes you feel that that can be easier to control when you build it in-house. But then what layers on to that is what we were talking about earlier, maintaining those legacy systems, continually upgrading them, and as David just mentioned, hoping and praying that some of that wonderful talent will stay with your organization so that they're able to continue and see the progress of that tool and help you through. And so when we at the House of Commons think about de-risking that model and thinking about how we need to look towards the future, of course, we want to retain and we want to develop talent, but we know in today's environment, it's a little bit different. People don't necessarily build careers like they used to quite a while ago, and they may change careers. And so how do we make partnerships with outside organizations, with other parliaments, with business, in order to make sure that we have the right balance between the insourcing and the self-built apps and leveraging technology that's available to us externally? And I think the pandemic really opened our eyes to some of that in some way, because we had to adjust and adapt very quickly to a changing set of circumstances. And so where maybe our reaction would have been to try to build something internally in the past if we had the time, given the reaction time, we had to really combine that with what was available externally. And I really appreciated Ari's comment there, because I think that relationship between whether it's the private sector, the business, and the technological folks is really, really important. And that's something that we've been trying to really foster and develop at the House of Commons, is creating those embedded product teams of procedural people and technical people, of the people doing the frontline operations and hearing directly from the members and directly giving the advice, and the people who know how to build and what's even possible. So continuing to build those relationships between us being able to say, this is what I need it to do, and someone else helping us to make that reality happen. And through that integration of our teams, we've seen a lot of success in terms of being able to provide those services, and also having better awareness of what's out there and what we can actually use to bring into to serve our members, and de-risk and take away some of the heaviness of trying to build something that's perfect for our individual situation.
If you allow me, I'd like to bring an additional question for you, since we have the time, and it's related to what we just discussed on this last question. It's about how can we create flexible funding models or budgets for modernization that can adapt to future uncertainties. I understand that one possibility is what we just discussed: international cooperation, interparliamentary cooperation, cooperation with private organizations, with NGOs as well. But what are the other elements that we could consider when designing a budget that's flexible enough for a moment of uncertainty? We have the possibility to adapt and not to have the need to cancel entire projects in this particular moment of uncertainty. Natalie, would you like to comment on that?
Sure, thank you. I think for us, part of this goes to a little bit the insourcing, but also making the project teams a little bit more flexible and agile. So it's not necessarily goes straight to the budget question, but when you're given a set envelope and you have these surprises that get lobbed at you either through legislation or environmental situations, you have to really consider the team in place and the resources that you have and how to make them most effective. And so one thing that we've been doing more and more at the House of Commons is adopting the agile methodology and embedding teams together as a necessary and a concurrent process. So part of the beauty, I would like to say, of my own team is that it's a team of people who bridge that gap between the proceduralists and the legislative workers and the technological teams. So it takes pressure off of the people delivering frontline services, and it creates that connection with the technology teams. And we actually embed them together in what we call product lines. So there's a product line for legislation and diplomacy. And it's a team that gets together, they continuously set priorities, they're continuously reviving their priorities, and they're continuously developing. They're not waiting on a senior exec or a leader or a manager to tell them what to do or how to organize themselves. They're actually doing it live, and they're doing that because they have the expertise that they're sharing. So even going back to that point Ari made earlier about the technology and the procedural people understanding a little bit what they do. Increasingly, those lines are blurred. And so by having a team like that, you can be a little bit more agile and flexible and maybe achieve more with the little budget that you're given. So it builds in a little bit of flexibility in terms of priorities or in terms of those surprises. So maybe I'll leave it there and see what the other co-panelists have to say.
Thank you so much, Natalie. David, would like to comment on this question as well?
Yeah, and we take a similar approach that our business systems owners are proceduralists who work closely with their technical counterparts. Our model, I suppose, used to be the opposite one, that our ICT team and external providers would often tell us what we could have. And we've really now got to a point of not us just saying what we want and asking for it to be delivered, but collaborating to figure out what's best, which is a mixture of what would be great for the Parliament and what's possible and what we can afford. And so really, I think that mixed approach is best. The other, I think, I did have another point, and it's just gone from my mind. Could I come back in a minute, perhaps after Ari's commented, if I can remember what it is? Thank you.
David, would you like to come back from there?
Yeah, thank you. It came back to me. And the thing, one of the things that we have, but only in quite a small area, is a multi-year appropriation. And so Parliament votes to my office money across a 3-year term. but not for the whole organisation. Actually, at the moment, it's only in the part of our organisation that engages with other parliaments. So it's around member development and sort of interparliamentary diplomacy. So that 3-year appropriation does introduce, while the overall quantum of money isn't any greater, it does give us quite a lot more flexibility in how to use it and spend it. And so if there's something really important, we can front load and use the money at the start, knowing that there will be less in the outgoing years, or save it for, something that we know is coming up. That sort of approach, I think, would be really useful. And it's quite well established in the New Zealand public finance system that that's possible. I think it would be a good approach for the whole, for all parliamentary funding, though. Without any great risk, providing it's managed properly. As I say, the overall sums are not different. It's just that they can be used in a different way. And I think that would help with some surprises, or those things that Natalie mentioned, that there's suddenly a need to comply with something, and so there has to be a change that's made, but also perhaps allow you to plan and accumulate funds a little bit for something that is coming up. The other thing that we're trying to make some progress on here is actually having Parliament setting its own budget. I don't mean me, I do mean parliamentarians. And I mean directly doing it, as they do for our officers of Parliament, so our Ombudsman, our Auditor General. A parliamentary committee actually considers what funding they need and recommends it, and the government, by convention, goes along with that. I think that would be a really useful model for Parliament as well. Not to see huge increases in the volume of funds, although some would be good, but actually to have a direct channel to those who are affected by the lack of funding, or the impact of increasing it. I think that would be really the single biggest change we could make. And I did make some progress on this term. Unfortunately, we've now run out of time before the election. So we'll see what the government after the election thinks of it.
Actually, David, allow me to ask you a follow-up question for you, for Natalie as well. The topic we're discussing here in the conference is artificial intelligence applied to parliamentary operations. Do you have any planning, or are you considering to draft for next fiscal year specific budget to explore AI in your parliament services, or how are you approaching this out of curiosity?
I can go first if you like. We don't have a specific budget for it, but we're certainly aware of it and thinking about how we could use it. But we're really just at the very early stages of thinking how it could be useful for us. And one of the areas that could be hugely helpful is, I mentioned that we're getting a big volume of public submissions to select committees, which is excellent. Sometimes 100,000 or more on a piece of legislation. In a population of 5 million, that's a substantial number of people. But with a committee secretariat of 3 people, it's also a lot to do with. We're wondering whether there is some value in, whether AI could actually help us process and sort a lot of those submissions. Really, what we're looking for them in them for are things that might be defamatory or unparliamentary that need discussing with the committee before they're publicly released, and whether it actually could help us sort through that huge volume of documents and perhaps learn from that and be trained to do it better and better. That is one area where we think it could be useful. Another one might be in guiding the public who want to make submissions to a committee to give evidence to it, not to write their submission for them, although of course we all know that it could do that now, but perhaps for those people who don't want to make perhaps a formal and lengthy written submission, but want to say more than just I support this or I don't support it, whether it could actually help guide them through it and support people in doing that could also be really useful. And then the third area we're thinking about it in is in Hansard, so the transcription of debates, along with voice recognition. It could probably do a lot of that work, and a lot of that transcribing and publication work happens late at night, but actually don't have to work into the night transcribing everything that's said. So I think there are some real advantages, but we're just not at a point at the moment where there's either any funding for it or that we've done more than have ideas about it. But I do think, it's right to treat it a little bit cautiously and think about how you're going to use it and what data you're going to give it and what it might do. But there's also really huge opportunities to enable staff to focus on things that only people can do for now.
Thank you so much, David, for your thoughts on this. Natalie, would you like to comment on that? Are you preparing any specific fund for implementation of AI in the House of Commons in Canada?
Sure. So we have a few projects actually that we've already started, a little bit along the lines of what David mentioned. So we have set aside some funds to do the automatic speech recognition for our Hansard committee transcripts using a form of AI in order, like a system that can learn and that can improve over time as well. It's an investment, but it makes a lot of sense. So we are anticipating that it could save up to 20% of operating expenses in that team and allow, just like David said, to our people to focus on the value that they really bring, which is more in the editing and refining and maybe getting the documents out faster and not needing to spend as much time late in the night doing that kind of work. So that's one that we already have ongoing and we already have funding set aside for. We also have within our technology team, I think there was a presentation earlier this week from a colleague of mine, Yasin, who maybe described some of this, but they have some folks who they get some free time to sort of work on and workshop things that could possibly work. And so looking at the use of AI for closed captioning around accessibility, for broadcasting, for facial recognition, potentially in terms of broadcasting. So the ability to create space. So in terms of financing, we've been, besides the automatic speech recognition process, it's really been internal at this time and just creating space for some of those employees to explore ideas and to put proposals so that we can start to think through what we might want to do. And then actually just this week, on Monday, we had a workshop on AI, and it was experts from across the House who came together, some folks who have presented here, and we did some work with some academics and researchers to try to define what priorities we could be interested in pursuing without necessarily making some decisions. So some common themes that came back were the things that I'd already mentioned, but also as a bilingual parliament, how we can leverage that to assist with translation, with interpretation, textual analysis. We think about the work that clerks do or that our legal teams do in terms of drafting bills, in terms of procedural advice, speakers' rulings, the ability of technology and particularly AI to assist with that and maybe to provide some drafts that then the human can actually add the value and add the lens of the political judgment or the sort of procedural lens and the history of that, knowing what the members or the speaker might expect. So rather than do that first draft, we're adding the value and we're really able to focus on that part of the work. So right now it's internal exploring, and then we want to use that to build our internal and external roadmap for where we want to go together. So a little bit in the initial stages of that still, but we're quite interested in how that might be leveraged to make not only our jobs easier, the jobs of members easier, and so that employees are really adding value to a lot of these processes. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Natalie. When David mentioned the automatic transcription, the participation from Yassini came to mind. He very passionately introduced this project to us on Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, just it came to mind a possibility for an article here, which is the possible return for investment on AI in parliaments. Because what Natalie said is and David as well, is very interesting. How much are we saving money on investing on AI, on automatic transcription, for example, on legislative drafting?
And I think it was really that point that most parliamentary administrations, if they're able to save money by automating something, are likely to want to reinvest it in something else, you know, and to increase capability rather than to save money for the sake of it. And, you know, certainly in our Hansard area where we've used ASR, all of the Hansard staff still work. It's just that they use the editing skills across the whole organisation far more than they transcribe. And, you know, I guess the next stage of that for us would be that the same system that captions for the deaf might also be doing the transcription. It's the same words. The same system might be interpreted into New Zealand Sign Language. And the same system might be interpreting from, you know, the Indigenous Māori language into English and vice versa, which is currently done by people. And, you know, as Natalie's comment about being bilingual, that made me think, well, that could be a really useful tool, particularly for a language that's not spoken in any other country and has quite a small, you know, fluent population. There's huge possibilities, and they're all probably about growing capability of doing things. And redirecting funding because, you know, new things are possible and manual things are done in a split second by a machine rather than a person.
Thank you so much, David, for your considerations. I see that we are reaching the limit of our time here. I will yield the floor to each one of you for any final thoughts on today's debate. Natalie, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. Actually, that it ties in well with the last comments, because I think, just to echo the same thing, the possibilities of all these technologies, for us too, it's not about replacing staff, but really adding value to the processes and using the skills, the unique skills that they have, to take away some of the repetitive tasks and allow them to focus on those. And I think that's the power of some of those tools as we move forward. It will be interesting to see how we can share ideas amongst parliaments and amongst practitioners in this area, to see how we can enhance further the services that we can offer. I guess a few closing thoughts. I might return to something we talked about a little bit earlier, but just the close relationship between the procedural teams and the technical teams, and really building on that success. I think increasingly through this discussion and other discussions that have been held at this forum, we're starting to see the lines blurring more and more between those two worlds. So technology is becoming intimately linked with procedure and vice versa. And so now you really need to develop proceduralists who are digitally aware, and you need to develop your technical teams to be a little bit more aware about the procedure. So a lot of our training has focused on integrating those teams, on allowing them to exchange on how a procedural process affects the technology and vice versa, so that when we talk to each other about enhancements, changes, problems that arise, people understand the perspectives of their colleagues in that sense. So as leaders, allowing our teams to build those relationships, allowing our teams to work in that agile environment where they get to set some of the priorities, where they get to determine how to spend some of their human capital on solving problems. I think that's something that we have to continue to do, delegating some decision-making power, being willing to let go of some of that, so that they can really move ahead without having to wait for some of those bigger decisions. Obviously, on big strategic questions, it makes sense to include senior leaders there, but on the day-to-day, I think really empowering your team to make those decisions is an important part of using the funding and the limited funding that you have in the most flexible way possible. So having those integrated view of priorities on the long term, integrated teams, I think is one way to achieve that. And also to mitigate some of the risks we talked about earlier in terms of retention and talent. So you have a built-in system where people are engaged and they want to stay. And even if they do move on to other things, you've got that built-in training and that built-in relationship when somebody comes into the role. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for your comments and for your final considerations. David, I noticed something that Natalie mentioned about having people on the procedural side also being ready for the digital. And I was even going to check, not to being precise, but last year you participated in a panel exactly about this topic, on how to interface the rules of procedure in the digital transformation. So just to make this recognition. But feel free to use the floor and to share your final considerations on this panel, on this topic.
Thank you. And I thought of exactly that, and some of the areas where that integration between the two was really important during the pandemic, in terms of being able to deliver a hybrid sitting in the House with members participating remotely and in person, and committees meeting the same way. It had to be done very, very quickly, but it did need that alignment of the rules of procedure, the kind of constitutional overlay and the technology. And yeah, increasingly they can't be completely isolated teams. There are always going to be people with more strengths in one area than the other, but you can't be a purist, I think, and that's not a bad thing. If people develop skills in new areas, well, then that's great, and we're not sort of finite in terms of the number of things we can know about. So I think that is really good. I suppose the couple of points I'd make to finish are particularly technology has a huge role to play, and there are some things that we simply couldn't do without it anymore. And I thought during this presentation of written questions to ministers, for example, we have about 50,000 of them a year. They did used to be done on paper, and they've grown hugely in every parliament, and it just couldn't be done any other way. The next step is probably, what can AI do to be that first scrutineer of those questions, and then alert a human to the ones that need more attention. So there's definitely room for development there. I suppose the counter to that is
not everything actually needs to be changed, and not everything has a technology solution that's needed. For example, when we choose private members' bills for introduction, bills that are not sponsored by a government minister, we draw them out of a cookie jar using numbered counters. And we've always done it that way. People like it. It's good. The jar's got its own social media presence, and it's called the biscuit tin of democracy. And people love it, but it actually cost us only a few dollars many years ago. It can't break down. We've got spare tokens just in case we lose them. It doesn't ever need upgrading, and it's perfectly fitted to actually what is quite a simple process, but that needs to be fair and random. And so I do think it's really important we always think about, what can we improve and how. But I do also have in the back of my mind, sometimes a cookie jar is fine.